Ancient Egypt did not last for 3,000 years by accident. It did not survive because of luck, mystery, or blind tradition. It survived because it functioned. While many ancient societies burned brightly and collapsed quickly, Egypt continued with the same underlying systems, refined but rarely replaced, generation after generation. It operated through planning, record-keeping, labor organization, food control, seasonal timing, and human predictability. This was not a fragile civilization improvising its future. It was a machine that learned how to keep itself running. Most people living inside that system never saw the whole structure. They experienced only their part of the motion: working, storing, building, recording, distributing. Yet those small, repeated actions synchronized across the land with remarkable consistency. No modern technology, no rapid innovation cycles, just systems designed to endure rather than to change. In this video, we are not talking about myths, rituals, or beliefs. We are talking about logistics, administration, incentives, and discipline. We are talking about how a civilization organized people, time, resources, and labor so efficiently that it outlasted rivals by centuries. Stay until the end, because once you see how this machine actually worked, you'll understand why stopping it was far more difficult than starting it. And if you enjoy calm, realistic history that explains how societies truly functioned, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. Ancient Egypt did not begin as an organized machine because of intelligence alone. It began that way because its environment rewarded predictability more than chaos. Long before administration, records, or labor management reached maturity, the land itself trained people to think in cycles, to expect repetition, and to trust systems that worked the same way every year. This environmental stability was not a background detail. It was the foundation that made everything else possible. The Nile Valley was narrow, constrained, and highly focused. Unlike regions where resources were scattered across wide territories, Egypt's usable land existed in a long, thin corridor. This geography forced concentration. People lived close together, worked similar land, faced similar conditions, and depended on the same water cycle. Such concentration naturally encouraged coordination. When everyone relies on the same narrow strip of land, cooperation becomes more efficient than conflict. The annual flooding of the Nile followed a rhythm that was not perfectly identical each year, but predictable enough to plan around. This predictability trained long-term thinking. Instead of reacting constantly to surprise, people learned to prepare, store, measure, and schedule. Over generations, these habits became institutional. The environment did not demand improvisation. It rewarded organization. Because arable land was limited, boundaries were clear, fields were defined, responsibilities were trackable, yield could be observed and compared year after year. This allowed early administrators to think in numbers rather than guesses. Production could be estimated. Shortages could be anticipated. Surpluses could be redirected. This numerical mindset is a key feature of any machine-like system. Unlike societies dependent on irregular rainfall, Egypt's agricultural core did not collapse suddenly due to random drought patterns. Variation existed, but it was manageable. This allowed continuity. Continuity allowed record-keeping to matter. In unstable environments, records become useless quickly. In Egypt, records retained value over decades. The environment also shaped labor behavior. Agricultural work followed seasonal intensity rather than constant pressure. During peak seasons, labor demand surged. During off-seasons, labor became available for other tasks. This surplus labor did not disappear. It was redirected. Over time, this redirection became systematic. Crucially, this was not forced improvisation. It was routine. Every year followed roughly the same pattern. People came to expect that certain months required collective effort and others allowed redistribution of work. This expectation allowed planners to think beyond survival and toward maintenance and expansion. The narrowness of the Nile Valley also limited dispersal. People did not spread endlessly into unknown territory. Settlement remained dense. Density improved communication. Information traveled faster. Oversight became practical. Systems depend on visibility. Egypt's geography made visibility normal. Because movement was constrained, population stability was high. People lived near where they were born. Skills passed locally. Knowledge accumulated instead of dispersing. This allowed refinement rather than reinvention. A machine improves by repetition, not by constant redesign. Environmental stability also reduced the psychological stress of unpredictability. When people trust that next year will resemble this one, they invest in long-term systems. They build storage instead of hoarding. They cooperate instead of fleeing. This trust is essential for bureaucratic thinking. Importantly, Egypt did not need to conquer its environment aggressively. It needed to manage it. Management favors administration. Administration favors hierarchy, roles, and documentation. Over centuries, these roles solidified into a system that could operate without constant innovation. The environment also discouraged fragmentation. There were no multiple competing agricultural zones with wildly different conditions. This reduced regional divergence. When regions behave similarly, centralized planning becomes viable. Differences exist, but they are differences of degree, not of kind. Trade routes followed the same corridor. Transport moved along predictable paths. This simplified logistics. Goods flowed linearly rather than diffusely. A linear system is easier to monitor, tax, and regulate than a scattered one. Because food production was reliable, population growth was gradual and manageable. Sudden population crashes were less frequent than in more volatile regions. This demographic stability supported institutional memory. Institutions need time to mature. Egypt had that time. Over centuries, people internalized the rhythm of the land. Time itself became mechanical. Seasons were not surprises. They were phases. Work was not chaotic. It was scheduled. This mental shift, from reaction to expectation, is what separates survival societies from system societies. By the time complex administration emerged, people were already accustomed to thinking in cycles, quotas, and routines. The environment had trained them to accept structure long before structure was imposed. This is why Egypt did not need to reinvent itself every generation. The land did not change dramatically. The rhythms did not collapse. Stability became cultural default. Change became something to manage carefully rather than pursue aggressively. A machine does not require brilliance at every moment. It requires reliability. Egypt's environment supplied reliability consistently enough to allow human systems to lock into place and remain there. When later societies attempted similar administrative control in unstable environments, they struggled. Their systems broke under unpredictability. Egypt's did not, because unpredictability was limited. This does not mean Egypt was static. Adjustments occurred constantly, but adjustments were incremental, not revolutionary. Incremental change preserves machines. Sudden change destroys them. The land shaped expectations. Expectations shaped behavior. Behavior shaped institutions. Institutions reinforced expectations. The cycle fed itself. By the time Egypt reached full administrative maturity, it was not merely using its environment. It was synchronized with it. That synchronization is what allowed the civilization to run continuously for 3,000 years. This is the first and most important reason Egypt functioned like a machine. Before records, before labor control, before logistics, there was a predictable system that rewarded order and punished chaos without needing ideology or belief. Everything else was built on that foundation. Once the environment had created predictability, ancient Egypt took the next crucial step that transformed stability into endurance. It began to measure. Measurement is what separates habit from system. Habits can survive for generations, but only systems can scale, correct themselves, and persist for centuries. Egypt did not merely rely on experience, it recorded it. Counting emerged not as an abstract idea, but as a practical necessity. When land floods and recedes every year, boundaries must be reestablished. When harvests vary slightly, yields must be compared. When labor is redistributed seasonally, availability must be tracked. These problems do not solve themselves through memory alone. They require numbers. Measurement introduced accountability. Fields could be assessed. Output could be estimated. Shortfalls became visible. Surpluses became identifiable. Visibility is the foundation of control. A system cannot regulate what it cannot see. Egypt learned to see its own production. Records turn time into data. A single harvest means little. 10 harvests reveal patterns. 50 harvests create expectation. Over generations, records allowed administrators to distinguish anomaly from trend. This distinction is critical. Machines survive by responding to trends. not panicking at anomalies. Writing, in this context, was not about expression. It was about storage of information beyond human memory. Memory fades, distorts, and dies. Records persist. When knowledge outlives individuals, institutions can outlive generations. This shifted power away from individuals and toward systems. Decisions were no longer based solely on personal judgment. They were informed by accumulated data. This reduced dependence on exceptional leadership and increased reliance on procedure. Procedures are stable. Personalities are not. Measurement also standardized reality. Once land, grain, labor, and time are measured, they become comparable. Comparability enables allocation. Allocation enables planning. Planning enables continuity. Crucially, this measurement was repeated relentlessly. Year after year, the same data points were collected. Repetition refined accuracy. Errors were noticed and corrected. Over time, measurement became routine rather than exceptional. Routine measurement transformed labor into a resource rather than a reaction. Instead of asking who was available at the moment, planners knew roughly how many people could be mobilized during certain seasons. Labor became predictable. Predictable labor is a mechanical component. Records also reduce conflict. When obligations are vague, disputes arise. When obligations are quantified, negotiation narrows. People may disagree, but the framework limits disagreement. This keeps the system functioning even under strain. Importantly, this was not rigid inflexibility. Measurements allowed adjustment. If one area underperformed, redistribution could compensate. If yields dropped, reserves could be managed. Flexibility inside a measured framework is what keeps a machine running without breaking. Storage played a key role here. Measurement without storage is useless. Storage allowed time to be smoothed. Surplus from good years supported bad ones. This smoothing reduced crisis frequency. Fewer crises meant fewer system resets. Machines thrive on continuity. Because records existed, responsibility could be traced. If something failed, it was possible to identify where. This discouraged negligence and encouraged consistency. Again, not through fear alone, but through structure. Over centuries, this produced institutional memory. Decisions were informed by what had worked before. Change was incremental. Successful procedures were retained. Failed ones were modified or abandoned. This evolutionary refinement is characteristic of durable systems. Measurement also shaped mindset. People working inside the system came to think in quantities and cycles. Output mattered. Timing mattered. Efficiency mattered. These are mechanical concepts applied to human activity. Unlike societies where knowledge was lost with leadership change or collapse, Egypt's records preserved continuity. Even when leadership shifted, procedures remained. This insulated the system from individual failure. The act of recording also created feedback loops. Feedback allows correction. Correction prevents collapse. Without feedback, systems drift until they fail. Egypt minimized drift by watching itself carefully. This self-observation is a hallmark of machines. Machines monitor their own performance. Ancient Egypt did the same, using human administrators instead of sensors. Over time, records became less about survival and more about optimization. How can output be maximized? How can labor be distributed more evenly? How can waste be reduced? These questions only arise when basic stability is achieved. By answering them slowly and methodically, Egypt avoided radical overhauls. Radical overhauls destroy machines. Incremental tuning preserves them. Measurement also reduced uncertainty. Uncertainty breeds improvisation. Improvisation breeds inconsistency. Inconsistency breaks systems. Egypt replaced uncertainty with approximation. Approximation was good enough. Even when measurements were imperfect, they were consistent. Consistency matters more than precision in long-term systems. A machine can function with approximate inputs if those inputs are predictable. This approach explains why Egypt could endure long periods without dramatic innovation. It did not need constant invention. It needed reliable repetition. Counting did not make Egypt powerful overnight. It made Egypt durable over centuries. Durability is less visible than power, but far more difficult to achieve. By turning land, labor, time, and output into data, Egypt crossed a threshold. It stopped reacting to the world and began regulating itself. Regulation is the essence of machinery. This is why ancient Egypt did not simply survive. It operated. and operation, once established, carried it forward for 3,000 years. Once measurement and record-keeping were in place, ancient Egypt crossed a second threshold that most early societies never reached. It built bureaucracy not as an emergency tool, but as a permanent operating system. Bureaucracy is often imagined as paperwork and authority, but in Egypt it functioned as something far more fundamental. It was the mechanism that synchronized millions of individual actions into a single, continuous process. The key to this system was role definition. People were not treated as interchangeable bodies reacting to circumstance. They were assigned functions that persisted across years and generations. A function had expectations, limits, and predictable outputs. When individuals filled those functions reliably, the system no longer depended on improvisation. This did not require complex technology. It required consistency. Egypt achieved consistency by narrowing roles and repeating them endlessly. Narrow roles are easier to train, easier to monitor, and easier to replace. Machines depend on components that behave predictably. Egypt shaped human labor to meet that requirement. Administration began locally. Small units tracked land, labor, and output. These units reported upward. The flow of information was hierarchical, but not chaotic. Each level summarized rather than reinvented data. Summarization reduces noise. Reduced noise improves decision-making. This structure mattered enormously. Many early societies collapsed because information became distorted as it moved upward. Egypt minimized distortion by standardizing reporting. Standardization is mechanical thinking applied to governance. People inside the system did not need to understand the whole. They only needed to understand their part. This reduced cognitive load. When individuals are responsible only for specific tasks, error rates drop and continuity improves. The bureaucracy also separated decision from execution. Planners planned. Workers worked. Record keepers recorded. Inspectors inspected. This separation prevented overload. Overloaded systems fail. Distributed systems endure. Importantly, this was not rigid micromanagement. It was structured delegation. Once procedures were established, most tasks ran on routine. Routine reduced friction. Friction destroys machines over time. Labor organization followed seasonal logic. During agricultural downtime, labor could be reassigned predictably. This reassignment was not improvised annually. It followed known patterns. People expected it. Expectation reduced resistance and increased efficiency. The system also accounted for absence, illness, and variation. Because roles were defined, substitutes could be identified. Training focused on function rather than creativity. This allowed continuity even when individuals were lost. Record keepers played a critical role here. They did not command labor directly. They made labor visible. Visibility allowed coordination. Coordination reduced waste. Waste weakened systems. Unlike societies where authority depended on constant presence, Egypt's bureaucracy functioned even when leaders were distant. Procedures carried authority. When authority lives in procedure rather than person, stability increases. Bureaucracy also stabilized incentives. People knew what was expected and what compliance produced. Predictable incentives reduce conflict. Conflict interrupts processes. Egypt minimized interruption. Crucially, this system did not aim to maximize individual output at all costs. It aimed to maintain steady output indefinitely. Steady output is more valuable to long-term survival than short bursts of productivity. Because roles were stable, skills accumulated locally. People became highly proficient at narrow tasks. Proficiency increased reliability. Reliability is a machine's core requirement. The system tolerated limited inefficiency because it valued continuity more than optimization. Optimization without stability leads to collapse. Egypt optimized slowly. Another important feature was redundancy. Multiple administrators tracked similar data. Redundancy catches errors. Redundancy is expensive short-term but invaluable long-term. Egypt invested in it. Bureaucracy also allowed accountability without constant punishment. When output deviated from expectation, investigation followed. Investigation does not require violence. It requires records. Records created consequence without chaos. Over time, this created institutional momentum. New generations entered an already functioning system. They did not design it. They inherited it. Inheriting a working system discourages experimentation. Machines resist redesign when they are still operating. The bureaucracy also absorbed shocks. When floods were weaker or stronger than usual, records informed response. When labor was disrupted, reassignment followed procedure. Crisis management became procedural rather than reactive. This procedural response is what separates machines from fragile structures. Fragile systems panic. Machines adjust. Importantly, people inside the system experience bureaucracy not as constant control, but as normal life. Roles felt natural. Procedures felt familiar. Predictability reduced anxiety. The system did not need people to be inspired. It needed them to be reliable. Reliability was rewarded socially and materially. Over time, reliability became a cultural value. This value reinforced the machine. People who fit smoothly into roles succeeded. People who disrupted flow were corrected or sidelined. The system selected for compatibility rather than creativity. Creativity still existed, but it was channeled into refinement rather than transformation. Small improvements were accepted. Large changes were rare. This protected continuity. The bureaucracy also preserved knowledge. When individuals died, their knowledge did not vanish. Procedures remained. Records remained. The system remembered. This memory allowed Egypt to avoid repeating mistakes endlessly. Learning occurred across generations. Learning stabilized the machine. In many societies, bureaucracy grows rapidly and collapses under its own weight. Egypt avoided this by keeping bureaucracy focused on core functions: land, labor, storage, distribution. Peripheral complexity was limited. This focus prevented overload. Overloaded systems fail. Focused systems endure. The result was a civilization that did not rely on constant expansion or innovation to survive. It relied on maintenance. Maintenance is unglamorous, but it is what machines do best. For 3,000 years, Egypt maintained itself. Not perfectly, not without adjustment, but continuously. This continuity was not accidental. It was engineered through role division, record keeping, delegation, redundancy, and procedural authority. People were not merely living in Egypt. They were operating it. And once people become components of a functioning system, that system can outlast generations, leaders, and even crises. This is why ancient Egypt did not just exist for 3,000 years. Once bureaucracy divided roles and stabilized procedures, the Egyptian system faced a deeper challenge: keeping millions of people aligned with those roles year after year without relying on constant coercion. A machine that depends on fear alone wears out its parts quickly. Ancient Egypt avoided this by building a system where predictability itself became the reward and deviation became inefficient rather than dramatic. The first mechanism was incentive through stability. Most people did not receive abstract rewards for obedience. They received something more valuable in a fragile ancient world: continuity. A predictable share of food, predictable work cycles, predictable expectations, and predictable outcomes. Predictability reduces anxiety. Reduced anxiety increases compliance without force. When people know roughly what will happen next month and next year, they plan their lives around that expectation. Planning creates attachment. Attachment discourages disruption. This psychological loop mattered as much as any physical control. Food distribution played a central role. Storage and redistribution were not occasional emergency measures. They were routine operations. Because reserves existed and were tracked, people learned that following procedure produced survival even during irregular years. This created trust in the system itself, not just in individuals. Trust changes behavior. People are far more willing to comply with systems they believe will function tomorrow. Short-lived systems invite hoarding, resistance, and opportunism. Egypt's long memory discouraged those instincts. Discipline in this context did not mean constant punishment. It meant correction through procedure. When output fell short or obligations were not met, response followed a known pattern: investigation, reassignment, adjustment. This procedural response removed emotion from discipline. Emotional punishment breeds resentment. Procedural correction breeds acceptance. Because responses were standardized, they felt impersonal. Impersonal systems feel fair even when they are strict. Fairness reduces resistance. Resistance disrupts machines. Another critical element was layered accountability. Responsibility was distributed across multiple levels. No single individual carried total blame for failure. This reduced fear while maintaining pressure. Moderate pressure over long periods is more effective than extreme pressure applied briefly. Predictability extended into consequences. People did not fear random outcomes. They feared known inefficiency. Inefficiency was costly. Cost discouraged deviation. This is mechanical control rather than authoritarian control. The system also rewarded reliability socially. Those who fulfilled roles consistently gained reputation, trust, and informal support. Reputation mattered because cooperation mattered. Cooperative networks reduce individual risk. People protected their reputation carefully. This social reinforcement reduced the need for oversight. When communities internalize standards, enforcement becomes collective. Collective enforcement feels less like domination and more like expectation. Importantly, Egypt did not demand perfection. It demanded consistency. Consistency is achievable. Perfection is not. By setting attainable standards, the system minimized rebellion driven by hopelessness. Labor organization reflected this philosophy. Tasks were demanding but finite. Completion mattered more than speed. Completion produced stability. Stability was valued above innovation. People learned that working within the system was more efficient than resisting it. Resistance required energy, negotiation, and risk. Compliance required routine. In a labor-intensive society, energy conservation mattered. Discipline also operated through substitution rather than elimination. When someone failed repeatedly, they were not always removed violently. They were reassigned, sidelined, or replaced. Replacement preserved function without creating spectacle. Spectacle is dangerous to machines. It attracts attention and emotion. Egypt minimized spectacle. Quiet correction kept the system invisible. Over time, people internalized these patterns. They adjusted behavior proactively. They avoided inefficiency before it occurred. Self-regulation replaced external discipline. Self-regulation is the highest achievement of any control system. It eliminates the need for constant monitoring. Egypt achieved this through routine, record-keeping, and social reinforcement. Predictability also structured ambition. People did not aim to escape the system. They aimed to perform well within it. Advancement meant smoother operation, not radical change. This redirected competitive energy into maintenance. Maintenance is the core function of machines. Egypt trained its population to value maintenance above transformation. Transformation risks breakdown. Maintenance extends lifespan. Even dissatisfaction was absorbed into this framework. When people felt strain, they adjusted expectations rather than confronting structure. The system did not promise comfort. It promised continuity. Continuity felt realistic. Over generations, this produced cultural alignment. Children observed adults navigating predictable routines successfully. Success was defined by survival and stability, not novelty. This definition passed naturally. Because the system rarely collapsed completely, people never experienced the absence of structure. Absence breeds questioning. Presence breeds acceptance. Egypt maintained presence. Discipline also benefited from record comparison. Output could be compared across regions and years. Comparison allowed calibration. Calibration reduced extremes. Extremes destabilized systems. By keeping variation within tolerable limits, Egypt avoided cascading failure. When one part underperformed, others compensated. Compensation is a machine's defense mechanism. Importantly, the system allowed small inefficiencies. Total efficiency is brittle. Slight inefficiency provides flexibility. Egypt tolerated waste when it preserved stability. This tolerance reduced pressure. Reduced pressure prevented burnout. Burnout destroys machines faster than inefficiency ever could. The combination of incentive through stability, discipline through procedure, and predictability through records created a self-sustaining loop. Each element reinforced the others. People did not need to be convinced daily. They needed only to experience that alignment worked better than resistance. Experience is more persuasive than ideology. This is why Egypt's system did not depend on constant leadership brilliance. It depended on structure. Leaders could change. Procedures remained. For 3,000 years, this balance held. Not because Egypt never faced crisis, but because crisis was absorbed rather than magnified. Machines fail when shocks exceed tolerance. Egypt raised tolerance gradually through storage, procedure, and social alignment. The result was a civilization that did not surge and collapse. It stabilized and persisted. Persistence is the true measure of a machine. Ancient Egypt ran not because people were forced every day, but because the system made continued participation the most efficient path forward. And efficiency, once internalized, keeps a machine running long after its creators are gone. Once bureaucracy and incentives aligned human behavior, the Egyptian system still faced a problem that no amount of organization alone could solve: survival over time. Survival at scale does not depend on strength or ambition. It depends on logistics. Ancient Egypt understood this earlier and more thoroughly than almost any other early society. It did not focus on dramatic expansion as its primary strategy. It focused on feeding people reliably, predictably, and continuously. Food was not treated as a private matter left entirely to individual households. It was treated as a strategic resource, not in moments of crisis alone, but as a constant concern. This shift from food as subsistence to food as infrastructure is one of the clearest signs that Egypt functioned like a machine rather than a loose collection of communities. The first step was central visibility. Grain production was not invisible to the state. It was measured, recorded, and compared. Once production becomes visible, it becomes manageable. Once it becomes manageable, it becomes controllable. Control here does not mean confiscation alone. It means coordination. Storage transforms time. Without storage, every bad season threatens collapse. With storage, bad seasons become manageable fluctuations. Egypt invested heavily in storage not as emergency preparation, but as routine practice. Grain moved from fields into centralized or semi-centralized storage systems year after year. This movement mattered. It created a flow. Machines depend on flow. Grain flowed upward into storage and outward into distribution. Flow replaced hoarding. Hoarding destabilizes systems. Flow stabilizes them. Because grain was stored collectively, distribution could be adjusted. Areas with lower yield could be supported. Labor could be redirected without risking starvation. This flexibility reduced the risk of regional collapse, spreading system-wide. Logistics also allowed labor to be mobilized for non-agricultural tasks without destroying food security. When food supply is predictable, people can be reassigned temporarily. This reassignment is impossible in societies living harvest to harvest. Egypt escaped that trap. Transportation played a crucial role. The Nile functioned as a natural conveyor belt. Moving goods along water requires less energy than moving them over land. This reduced logistical friction dramatically. Reduced friction increases reliability. Reliability keeps machines running. Because transport routes were stable, schedules became reliable. Reliability allowed planning months and years ahead. Planning ahead is impossible without confidence in logistics. Food control also smoothed social tension. Starvation breeds rebellion. Predictable access reduces desperation. Desperation leads to risk-taking. Risk-taking destabilizes systems. Egypt minimized desperation through distribution. Importantly, this distribution did not eliminate inequality. It eliminated unpredictability. Inequality can exist inside stable systems. Unpredictability cannot. Egypt chose stability. Food logistics also created leverage. People dependent on distribution aligned behavior accordingly. But this alignment did not feel like oppression. It felt like practicality. Practical systems endure longer than coercive ones. The system also benefited from redundancy. Multiple storage sites reduced the risk of total loss. Redundancy is expensive but essential. Machines survive by having backups. Records tracked not only quantities, but movement. Grain in storage is useless unless it moves where needed. Tracking movement prevented bottlenecks. Bottlenecks caused failure cascades. Egypt minimized them. Because logistics were routine, crisis response did not require reinvention. The same channels used during normal years were used during difficult ones. This continuity reduced panic. Panic destroys systems faster than shortage itself. Food control also disciplined time. People learned that certain periods involved distribution and others did not. This structured expectation. Expectation reduces conflict. Conflict interrupts flow. Unlike expansion-focused societies that stretched logistics thin, Egypt optimized its core before extending outward. This made the core resilient. Resilient cores survive shocks. The machine logic is clear here. Machines prioritize maintenance of essential inputs. For Egypt, food was the essential input. Everything else depended on it. Even administration itself relied on food logistics. Officials could function because they were fed. Record keepers could work because surplus freed them from subsistence labor. Bureaucracy is impossible without food surplus. Food logistics also enabled specialization. Specialization increases efficiency. Efficiency reduces waste. Reduced waste extends lifespan. Over centuries, people internalized this system. Food security became associated with participation rather than resistance. Participation felt safer. Safety encouraged compliance. This did not require constant enforcement. Hunger enforced alignment quietly. But because hunger was buffered by storage and distribution, it rarely became catastrophic. The system maintained pressure without collapse. The Egyptian approach contrasts sharply with societies that focused on conquest before logistics. Conquest expands territory faster than systems can absorb. Overextension breaks machines. Egypt avoided this trap. By prioritizing logistics over glory, Egypt traded rapid growth for longevity. Longevity proved more powerful. Even when expansion occurred, it was integrated slowly. New areas were connected to existing logistics rather than draining them. Integration preserved function. Food control also shaped population growth. Stable food supply allows gradual growth. Gradual growth avoids sudden strain. Sudden strain destroys systems. This gradualism appears again and again in Egypt's history. Slow change, managed adjustment, continuous operation. The machine metaphor holds because food logistics did not rely on exceptional years. It functioned under average conditions. Average conditions dominate history. Exceptional moments are rare. Machines are built to function most of the time, not to perform miracles occasionally. Egypt built its system accordingly. By ensuring that people were fed predictably, Egypt reduced the likelihood of mass unrest, collapse, or fragmentation. Food did not eliminate tension. It prevented desperation. Desperation is the enemy of order. Egypt kept desperation low enough to maintain coherence. For 3,000 years, this logic held. Grain moved. Records tracked. Distribution adjusted. People ate. Work continued. Not perfectly. Not without stress. But continuously. This is why ancient Egypt did not rely primarily on conquest, ideology, or constant reform to survive. It relied on logistics. And logistics, once mastered, keep machines running long after ambition fades. Once food logistics created stability and predictability, ancient Egypt solved a problem that destroyed many other early civilizations: how to move large numbers of people into concentrated labor without collapsing everyday life. Large projects do not fail because people are unwilling to work. They fail because labor is pulled at the wrong time, from the wrong place, or for too long. Egypt avoided this by treating labor as a scheduled resource rather than an emergency reaction. The first principle was timing. Labor was not mobilized randomly. It followed the same seasonal logic as agriculture. When fields required constant attention, labor stayed local. When agricultural demand dropped, labor became available. This was not improvisation. It was expectation. People knew when labor calls would arrive. Expectation reduces resistance. This seasonal rhythm allowed the state to draw on large numbers of workers without threatening food production. Other societies often forced labor during critical farming periods, creating cascading shortages. Egypt aligned labor demand with natural downtime. The machine stayed balanced. Labor was also divided into manageable units. Workers were grouped, tracked, and reassigned systematically. This prevented exhaustion and disorganization. Large numbers were broken into smaller components that could be supervised, supplied, and rotated. Rotation matters. Continuous strain destroys systems. Rotational strain sustains them. Supply followed labor. Workers were not expected to survive on improvisation. Food, tools, and basic support were delivered along established logistical routes. This prevented workers from draining local communities. Large projects did not starve surrounding regions because supplies moved with labor. Transportation made this possible. The Nile was not only a trade route, it was a labor artery. People moved along it as efficiently as goods. Movement by water reduced physical strain and time loss. Reduced strain increases productivity. Productivity shortens projects. Short projects reduce resistance. Importantly, labor mobilization was framed as participation rather than extraction. People were not constantly removed from their communities indefinitely. They served, returned, and resumed normal life. This cycle prevented alienation. Alienated workers resist. Integrated workers comply. The system also accounted for skill variation. Not all labor was treated equally. Some tasks required experience. Others required endurance. Assignment followed capability. Proper assignment reduces failure. Failure creates disruption. Records tracked labor contribution. Tracking mattered not only for control, but for planning. Administrators knew roughly how many workers could be mobilized without damaging agriculture or local stability. This prevented overreach. Overreach is the primary killer of ancient systems. Egypt avoided it through measurement and patience. Large projects were also staggered. Egypt did not attempt too many massive undertakings simultaneously. Resources were allocated sequentially rather than competitively. Competition for labor causes shortages. Sequencing preserves flow. Labor organization also benefited from social normalization. Participation in state projects became expected over time. Expectation removes novelty. Novelty breeds resistance. Normality breeds acceptance. Because labor demands were predictable, households adjusted. Families planned around absence. Communities adapted. Adaptation reduced friction. The system did not rely on constant supervision. Supervisors ensured coordination, not coercion. Coordination is quieter than force and far more sustainable. Crucially, labor was not mobilized indefinitely. Projects had defined durations. Endpoints matter. Endless demands exhaust compliance. Finite demands preserve it. The state also avoided draining the same populations repeatedly without rest. Geographic rotation spread burden. Burden distribution reduces resentment. This careful balancing allowed Egypt to undertake projects that appeared extraordinary without destabilizing everyday life. The machine absorbed strain because strain was anticipated, limited, and managed. Other societies attempted similar feats through urgency and compulsion. Urgency burns systems. Egypt used scheduling. Scheduling preserves them. Labor mobilization also reinforced identity. Participation signaled reliability. Reliability was socially rewarded. Social rewards strengthened alignment. Importantly, refusal was not the primary enforcement concern. Inefficiency was. Inefficiency delayed projects, increased costs, and threatened schedules. The system corrected inefficiency rather than dramatizing defiance. This procedural correction reduced spectacle. Spectacle attracts emotion. Emotion disrupts machines. Even conflicts within labor groups were handled locally where possible. Local resolution prevented escalation. Escalation drained systems. Over time, Egypt refined this labor machine. Early miscalculations were adjusted. Schedules improved. Supply chains tightened. Rotation optimized. Learning accumulated. Because the system learned slowly, it avoided catastrophic redesign. Machines that redesign themselves completely rarely survive. Egypt tuned rather than rebuilt. Labor mobilization also benefited from population stability. People did not migrate constantly. Skills remained localized. Local knowledge improved performance. Performance reduced project duration. Reduced duration mattered. Long projects accumulate error. Shorter projects preserve coherence. Egypt's ability to mobilize labor without breaking itself explains why it could sustain continuous construction, maintenance, and infrastructure development for centuries without systemic collapse. This was not because people were endlessly enthusiastic. It was because the system respected limits. Machines that respect limits endure. Machines that ignore limits burn out. Egypt respected agricultural cycles, human endurance, logistical capacity, and social cohesion. It did not push any component to failure routinely. By doing so, it ensured that labor was not a destructive force, but a renewable one. This is why Egypt's great projects did not mark the beginning of collapse, as they did elsewhere. They were absorbed into the machine's rhythm. The machine did not rush. It scheduled, and because it scheduled, it survived.